fundamental goal of government, any government, is to make a better world. A world that is safe from war and safe for democracy.
There's a moral question surrounding this issue.
And that's an identity. It's a pathway forward. It's a way to be.
If that as a goal of human striving does not lead directly to tyranny.
Here we have the essence and genius of Canadianism. Unity through division.
Your paycheck, your retirement, your home, your country.
Conservatism. Whichever way you cut it, it's a force to be reckoned with. It's one of the animating principles of liberal democracies, and some of democracy's staunchest defenders have called themselves conservatives. In Canada, every province, yes, even British Columbia, even though they call themselves liberals, has a conservative party. The present federal system in Canada was founded by a conservative party led by Sir John A. Macdonald, amid, it should be added, the resistance of the party which would become the Liberals. In other words, understanding conservatism is a big part of understanding Canada. But is there a connection between the Conservatives of 1867, Canada's earliest days, and those of today? It's been a long time, over 150 years. And even in the space of the last 40 years or so, conservatism today has changed dramatically. So much so that it's sometimes seen as pretty unrecognizable to members of the old guard. And yet, the name persists. When we're talking about a political movement that covers so much of Canadian history, which is so wrapped up in the political institutions of this country, we will have a lot of ground to cover. And so this is the first of at least 2 videos that are going to explore the question of conservatism in Canada. Today, we're going to be talking about fundamentals, the origins of the movement, the basic ideas that underlie it. We'll also be talking of necessity about conservatism in the United States and the United Kingdom. But the main purpose here is to understand what unites conservatism across time and across the many subgroups that exist within it. If you're a conservative, you might find yourself nodding along with some of the things I say here, or, completely rejecting everything I have to say. And I'd love to hear your take on what I have to say in the comments. If you're not conservative, you might be surprised about what you find, or confirmed in what you already suspected. Either way, I hope that you find a better understanding of what people think about and what they expect from Canada. And on that note, I do want to issue a sort of disclaimer. I don't know if you've heard, but people can get pretty intense about politics. And I'm pretty confident that people all over the political spectrum are going to be pissed off with the content of this video. I can already hear the furious clacking of commenters from my left-leaning audience accusing me of being an apologist, all the while those on my right are accusing me of exactly the opposite. My purpose with this series of videos has been, to whatever extent possible, to identify both what conservatives say about their worldview and how they have applied that worldview to the world of Canadian politics without passing judgment. If you're looking for me to dunk on conservatism or to hype it up, you might be watching the wrong video. That said, I'm not trying to be neutral per se. I'm trying to explain conservatism to the best of my ability from my point of view. If you don't like what I say, I could absolutely be wrong. But it could also be that you don't agree with my politics. And I kind of think that's okay. So, what do conservatives believe fundamentally? What drives them to shape Canada in the way that they have? What is conservative philosophy? So, one of the most basic just facts about conservatism, and one which frankly surprised me, is that it's actually very diverse as a movement. We've really got to speak about conservatisms. You've got your neocons, your theocons, your paleocons, your crunchy cons. Yes, crunchy cons. That's a thing. look it up. You got your blue Tories, your red Tories, the list goes on. And the thing is that some of these groups are kind of opposed to each other, or at least they don't see eye to eye on some pretty important subjects. Neocons, for instance, offer very little guidance on social issues, whereas for paleocons, it's the bread and butter of their movement. So what's the point of sticking all these folks together? Is there an actual thing called conservatism which unites them all? Stephen Harper, ex-Prime Minister of Canada, famous for his magnificent coif of Lego hair, to some extent defined a generation of conservatism in Canada, i.e. this one. And he has some interesting things to say on the topic of conservatisms.
Actually, what makes conservatism distinct as opposed to philosophies on the left is because conservatism is empirical and fundamentally cultural. Conservatism actually does differ to some degree in various entities, whereas liberalism and socialism and the realisms are they're kind of belief systems regardless. You've got to transform whatever society it is into that. So Canadian conservatism is different.
For Harper, the term conservative is, as he says, cultural. It's more contingent on local circumstances than is, for example, socialism or liberalism. This, first off, explains why there are so many conservatisms, right? It's because, Harper would argue, conservatism is in some sense more empirical. It's based more firmly in reality, not so much reality in general, but a specific local reality, the reality it's responding to at any given moment. Conservatism can't be the same everywhere because it responds to local considerations. What being conservative means in Guatemala, for example, must be different from what it would mean in Canada. Now, in practice, this can mean a lot of different things, of course. Harper, for instance, sees himself as having been a populist, really since he began to be involved with the Western Reform movement and Preston Manning in the 1980s. And populism is, we could argue, conservative empiricism par excellence. In his 2018 book, Right Here, Right Now. See what he did there? Right here, right now, because it's about now, and he's right-wing, and yeah. Political humor does that count as humor? Anyways, in his book, Right Here, Right Now, Harper breaks down populism as being at least inspired by the conflict between what he describes as the somewheres and the anywheres. Somewheres are the people who are forced to live through specific local conditions. They work a job, they can't move around very much, and they are connected to their local community. The anywheres, by contrast, are those people who are digital nomads. They could work anywhere in the world. They have a very transferable skill, often associated with things like Silicon Valley. It's the conflict between local considerations and global considerations. Populism, Harper argues, is a political movement based on the interests of the somewheres. They are essentially demanding that their interests be recognized, that they be respected. They mistrust elites and experts because their interests are, as they see it at least, global and in some sense more theoretical. Now, setting aside whether or not this is a valid framework, remember, my job here is to explain the ideas, not to decide whether they're right or wrong. That is your job. The point here is that Harper believes conservatives are dispositionally well placed to respond to populism. Conservatism is, and has always been, locally pragmatic. It can actually address the problems that these people see as a problem. Now, whether you see this as contradictory or not, Harper adds a little more to this. He argues that it's his specific expert knowledge as an economist that, above all, convinced him of his politics. I think that you could legitimately make the case that he sees a combination of local concerns and his expert knowledge as the final source of his worldview. And so, in other words, if Harper speaks for everyone, we could say that conservatives see conservatism as being about how things really are on the ground, rather than how they should be, how some bureaucrat or professor sees them. And actually, it's worth taking the time to explain the distinction that's being made here. It's pretty important when we talk about ideas, and especially political ones. It's the difference between what we call normative claims and descriptive claims. On the one hand, normative claims are claims about what is normal. If someone says, this is how things should be, then they are making what we call a normative claim. On the other hand, descriptive claims are those which simply seek to describe the world as it is. Stephen Harper is basically arguing that conservatism is in some sense less broadly normative than liberalism or socialism. It accepts how things are, it describes them, it's descriptive, and then seeks to respond to them. Okay, but that can't be everything, right? That's not everything that conservatism is. Well, not by a long shot. Did you see the runtime? So, setting aside whether or not a political philosophy could be entirely descriptive or not, it's worth taking a look at the ideas of Sir Roger Scruton, a British conservative philosopher, when he describes the essence of conservatism.
I think you've actually touched on what the real essence of conservatism is there. You know, that there are things that the conservation of which is actually fundamental to understanding the world as it is.
Right.
And if you lose those things, like the rules of grammar, the habits of good speech, or good manners, the sense of what a legal solution as opposed to a mere bullying solution to a conflict might be, all those things we used to be taught to us as part of becoming an adult. If you lose those things, you're at sea in the world. And I think that's one of the things that most worries me about modern education. You refer to this movement in our schools to abolish grammar as elitist. It's absolutely true that grammar is elitist because it makes a distinction between the people who know it and the people who don't.
Right.
And that's the kind of distinction that we all need if we're to survive,
Right.
not only as a civilization, but as individuals too.
Right.
So this is where the real arguments for conservatism, in my view, should be based, not in the economic sphere at all, but in these fundamental cultural inheritances.
Clearly, for Scruton, sick name by the way, for Scruton, there is absolutely something normative about conservatism. There are things, cultural things above all, which we should preserve because they help us make sense of the world. They give order to reality. We are, as he says, at sea without them. But what are these things? Or more importantly, do all conservatives agree on what they are? Probably not to that second one, right? Well, for many conservatives, there is an implicit trust in received wisdom and in the status quo, because at least in the case of the status quo, it's proved a certain degree of success, right? Controversial public intellectual and lobster enthusiast Jordan Peterson says something pretty interesting about the conservative mindset as far as what might be normative about it when he says,
Let's say you're heterosexual and you're monogamous and you're in a committed relationship. It's like all of a sudden you have an identity. Well, what's the identity? Well, it's easy. You get married, you have children, you raise them together, you tie your lives together, you try to build something for the decades, right? And that's an identity. It's a pathway forward. It's a way to be. Well, I'm gender fluid. It's like, okay, well, pick your pronoun. It's like, okay, well, what do you do tomorrow? Well, I don't know. I'm out there in no man's land. You don't want to be in no man's land. That's not good. You're off the beaten path. You think, well, I can go off the beaten path. It's like, you go off the beaten path and you just see how long you last. You're lucky if you're a highly creative person and you're very disciplined and you have most of your life in pristine order, you might be able to risk a substantial deviation from the beaten path and manage to maintain your sanity. But if you're a disorganized person and you wander off the pathway of tradition, you are in so much trouble you can't even possibly imagine it. There are things out there that you will encounter that you have absolutely no defense against whatsoever.
Now, once again, setting aside whether or not what Peterson says here is true or not, The point is that for many conservatives, there is a list of normative claims, a certain set of rules that guide the way we should live our life. Peterson did actually write a book called 12 Rules for Life. 12 normative claims, we could even say. Peterson, and I'd argue most conservatives, believes that these are the building blocks for a meaningful life, and they provide us with a roadmap for politics. But still, what actually are these rules? Is there a generally agreed upon set of rules across all conservative thinkers? Probably not. Remember, this is still in the context of that local pragmatism. What we can say for now, I think, is that there are two essential pieces to the conservative mindset. On the one hand, there is this apparent commitment to dealing with reality, to making empirical observations about how things are, to being descriptive and local in your outlook. The local, whatever that specifically means, is much more important than the general, and politics must always be aimed at serving the local rather than the general. At the same time, there is also a commitment to the existence and to the following of a received set of rules, which must be preserved. But I would argue that there's also a third piece that we're missing here, and which is to some extent implied by the first two. On the left, and it is usually meant as an insult, this is called reactionism. And it's best understood through the thought of the great granddaddy of conservatism himself, Edmund Burke. For many conservatives, and non-conservatives for that matter, Edmund Burke is where it all began. But who was he really, Like, in his heart? Can anyone ever truly know another person? Important questions, but mostly completely irrelevant. Edmund Burke was a member of British Parliament during the 18th century. And if you're at all a fan of history, you know that this was a pretty, messy time for world politics. Burke lived through and commented on both the American and French revolutions, and it's his response to both, but more famously the French Revolution, that really cemented his position as the braindaddy of modern conservatism. So before we get into Burke's ideas, let's take a minute and talk about the French Revolution. Man, I like making YouTube videos. So the French Revolution essentially began in 1789 and ended with Napoleon's ascension to the head of the French state. At its core, at least at first, it was about the rejection of the French monarchy. Maybe you've heard of Marie Antoinette and the whole let them eat cake thing? Yeah, she probably didn't actually say that, but it does capture the general feeling toward the French monarchy on the part of the French bourgeoisie middle class and the general population of France at the time. On the one hand, the monarchy had become decadent and remote from the concerns of most French people. Louis XVI, the king at the time, was pretty unconcerned with matters of governance, preferring to spend his time, for instance, collecting clocks. This is on top of the fact that his predecessor, Louis XIV, had centralized the French state to a degree never before seen, famously said, "Je suis l'État," or "I am the state." The idea here being that the French monarch had a lot of power. So much so that we refer to European monarchs who governed in the same way as absolute monarchs. Consequently, there was a perfect storm of absolute power in the hands of the monarch and absolute incompetence in the form of the actual monarch himself. However, while the French Revolution may have begun as the rejection of a shitty king, it soon grew to be much more. Based on the ideas of the contemporary philosophical movement known as the Enlightenment, the French Revolution sought to bring about through whatever means necessary, they cut off people's heads. Like a lot. What it saw as the three pillars of a just society: liberté, égalité, et fraternité. Liberty, equality, and brotherhood. So what on earth does any of this have to do with a British MP and conservatism more generally? Well, absolutely everything. The whole idea of left-wing and right-wing politics actually goes back to the French Revolution, where supporters of the king sat to the right of the president of the National Assembly, and supporters of cutting off his head sat to the left. Cons for the king, progressives for the chop. Huzzah! For Burke, though, the French Revolution was fundamentally wrong-headed. The Enlightenment ideals of liberty, equality, and brotherhood sounded nice, but they were no basis for a real functioning society. Or, well, it's complicated. They also sought to redraw the map of France into a grid. You won't be surprised that geography sometimes has other ideas. For Burke, society is an organism. It developed over time, over the centuries. Its principles, the logic which undergirds it all, can't simply be decided on one day and rejected the next. We inherit society, moreover, because it works. He says specifically, "I cannot conceive how any man can have brought himself to that pitch of presumption to consider his country as nothing but carte blanche, upon which he may scribble whatever he pleases. A man full of warm, speculative benevolence may wish his society otherwise constituted than he finds it. But a good patriot and a true politician always considers how he shall make the most of the existing materials of his country. A disposition to preserve and an ability to improve taken together would be my standard of a statesman. Everything else is vulgar in the conception, perilous in the execution. A subtle and thoughtful mind is that which offers a measure of respect for what is, and, in effect, makes the best of it." And that's really at the core of this third part of conservatism that I referred to in the last section as reactionism. It's quite literally a historical reaction to the historical left. In its very origins, it's a rejection of the left-wing view of the world. Burke goes on to say, "But what is liberty without wisdom and without virtue? It is the greatest of possible evils, for it is folly, vice, and madness without tuition or restraint." Burkean Conservatism. And I really want to stress that there are a lot of folks out there who call themselves conservatives, but who are not Burkean in the slightest. But Burkean conservatism is about pumping the brakes on left-wing utopianism, on the idea that the rejection of prior modes of life is an unalloyed good. Okay, so does this mean that we have a nice, tidy, three-part definition of conservatism? Let's review. As per Stephen Harper, and many conservatives, I'd say, conservatism is a practical philosophy. It's about responding to specific local concerns and making judgments about what to do based on that. And in Harper's case, sometimes informed by special knowledge like economics. In this way, it's also a rejection of larger scale programs for how to manage society. Secondly, conservatism is, as Roger Scruton and Jordan Peterson showed us, normative. It's the belief that there are certain rules for society which should govern our actions and which are justified by the fact that they have stood the test of time. Finally, conservatism is a rejection of utopianism. Burkean conservatism is about a rejection of the attempt to create a society from what it sees as essentially nothing. I think a conservative might say it's the philosophy of sober second thought. But why not go a little deeper? There's a really interesting set of essays called Conservatism in Canada, where the editors James Farney and David Rayside argue that conservatism can be seen as consisting of two related ideological positions. Firstly, conservatism is based on a resistance to change. And the word resistance here is key. Think Burkean sober second thought. Because secondly, conservatives accept change if it comes from an extra-human source. There is a mistrust toward the direct human meddling in things beyond their control. But What are these extra-human forces? Well, probably one of the most obvious ones historically would be God, right? Catholics, for instance, have historically represented a pretty important bastion for conservative thought in Europe and in the United States. Just think about the Reformation, for instance, where progressive reformers like Luther and Calvin sought to change the church. In that situation, being conservative meant rejecting the changes that these humans sought to effect in the church. Setting aside the fact that Luther and Calvin could definitely be seen as conservative in content, if not always form. Oh man, I have opened a can of worms. Yay, comment section! The point I'm trying to make is that a conservative impulse could be seen as the rejection of the human attempt to meddle, to interfere with what simply is. Another good example, and one which I have to say I didn't really understand until I started doing research for this video, is the conservative trust, in many cases, in the free market. From my point of view, it seems that there has been nothing more disruptive to traditional social orders than the markets of the last 400, 200 years. And yet, if we are to say that conservatism consists of a trust in extra-human sources of change, then the free market certainly seems to fit the bill, right? Now, to be clear, I don't want to give the impression that conservatives agree on all of this. In Canada, for instance, acceptance of free market economics represents a significant shift in the conservative consensus of the last 40 years. Suffice it to say that it does kind of fit neatly into the definition if we see the free market as simply another extra-human source for change. Okay. So how does this relate to my three-part structure? I think we can see evidence for it in every part. Conservatives see themselves as practical, as bound by local concerns, real concerns, economic forces, i.e., extra-human sources for change. The fact that Alberta or Ontario or Arkansas are where they are and have their own local realities is something you just gotta deal with. This is what Edmund Burke would have called the existing materials of the country. And in spite of this pragmatism, this descriptivism, conservatives also make normative claims about how the world should be based on the received wisdom of the past. The process of coming to that wisdom kind of sounds like an extra-human source for change. The organism of society has earned our deference for the simple fact that it has survived, for the simple fact of its longevity. Now, I get that on some level you might argue that this is not an extra-human source for change. What is society if not human? But it's also not just one human or one group of humans. Society can't speak for itself. It's literally, in the eyes of many conservatives, tradition. Its power over us is not by force, as would be the case with meddling humans, but by consent to respond to it, to follow its lead. Its origin may be human, but it becomes extra-human through the dynamic of history. George Grant, a very important conservative Canadian philosopher, yes, Canadian philosopher, we exist. In his book, Philosophy in the Mass Age, Grant argued that in past human societies, humans did not see their lives as having meaning through making history. And today we often think that, don't we? We say that someone is an important historical figure, and kids grow up wanting to make an impact. Well, for Grant, the ancient mindset was completely different. Kids grew up wanting to live their lives in accordance with the divine, in accordance with a preordained set of rules decided by nature, by God. The purpose of life wasn't to make an impact, but to live one's life in accordance with cosmic order. Now, Grant didn't argue that we should just literally change our minds in this way. Make Canada ancient again or something. But he did say that the ancient mindset should inform how we see the world and how we choose to interact with it, at least to some extent. He said, "I believed in a moral order which men did not measure and define, but by which we were measured and defined."
Ethics is, in short, not something we decide, something that's relational necessarily. It's eternal, and in some sense, independent of humans. Extra-human, even. For Grant, this was not a reason to be sad or to rage against the machine or whatever. It was precisely what gave life meaning, true meaning. Making an impact or making history are fleeting things. Living life in accordance with the structure of the universe is satisfying. I don't think that many conservatives necessarily go as deep as Grant, but the point is that this extra-human source for change is a big deal. It is for many what is truly important, fundamentally and profoundly so. And responding to that is the true aim of a good life and a guide for politics. At any rate, I should make the point that all of this is absolutely on a sliding scale. People, I don't know if you've heard, but they're complicated and not always entirely consistent. So sometimes people might agree with what I'm saying here, and sometimes definitely not. I've done my best, I think, to get to the fundamentals, but we're nowhere near being done, right? The fact of the matter is that for all these fundamentals, history is a thing that actually happened. And the way that conservatism was actually expressed in Canada, the things people did, the stuff they actually said, had a real impact on how Canada was created. And that is what we'll be getting to in part 2. Finally, thanks so much to my Patreon supporters. I really appreciate it. It makes this channel feel pretty meaningful when folks are willing to donate to help keep it running. So thank you to Fran, Robert, Danny, and Patty. And yes, I have 4, but you know, that could change if you wanted to check out my Patreon in the description.